How would you explain the Platonic realm of patterns that biology accesses to someone who is new to your work?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that this whole Platonic space business is only something that I've begun talking about recently. So the vast majority of my work to date has not emphasized this at all. It's kind of a something that we're able to bring now because now it can actually be helpful. It wasn't something that I emphasized before because we didn't really need it before, but I think now we need it. And in particular, now we have tools to actually explore that space, and so now it becomes actionable. So the idea, yeah, the idea is quite simple. There are let's go all the way back to where this idea really kind of first became prominent, at least in the Western world, was with Pythagoras and Plato. And the idea is that there are mathematical facts that don't seem to have explanations the way that physical facts do, which is usually either some law of physics or some historical selection, or in the case of evolution and biological beings. So there are all kinds of fascinating truths of number theory and distribution of primes and just all kinds of these things in mathematics that don't seem to have an explanation in the physical world. In other words, there's nothing you could change about the physical world to make those facts be any different. So I think it was pretty clear already, and those great thinkers made it explicit that there is a non-physical space of important patterns, and that these patterns do in fact matter for things that happen in the physical world. And the simplest kind of example that I give for people right off the bat is this idea. Just imagine there was a world where the highest fitness was a very specific kind of triangle. There was some kind of specific triangle, and it had the highest fitness. So just imagine evolution cranks through a bunch of generations, and it finds the first angle, and then it cranks through a bunch of more generations, finds a second angle. Now something amazing happens. You don't need to do it again and find the third angle. You already know what that angle has to be, and it's kind of a free lunch that you get from geometry, and it saves you as evolution. It saves a bunch of time. What I don't love about that example is that it's very spatial, and it makes people think that this is all about real shapes in the 3D world, and it's not. There are many examples I could give that have nothing to do with spatiality like that. But what I do like about it is that it just makes it clear that it's very practical. This is not some weird philosophical thing that you could choose to believe or not believe. It's just evolution saves a bunch of effort. In fact, one third in that case, one third of its effort it saves. So it's a very practical thing.
So, on a practical philosophical avenue, we need non physical patterns, right? Triangles, number theory, these exist even without a physical world. So, then tell me more about how biology would access it. So, okay, this has been known, Plato was around, but why biologists now needing to think about such non physical patterns?
Yeah, well, first of all, they've always needed to think about them. If you really want to understand certain phenomena, for example, there are cicadas that come out every, what is it, 13 and 17 years or something like that. And if you want to understand why those specific numbers, the actual answer is not anything about physics or chemistry. The actual answer is because those numbers don't have any factors, they're prime, and if you emerge on those on that time frame, it's the most difficult for predators to time your cycles and appear at the same time, right? So the explanation for why this is happening is not a physical explanation or a chemical explanation; it's a mathematical explanation. So this has already been here for a long time, and Darcy Thompson's book on growth and form, for example, from the 20s, shows a million examples where biology is just incredibly benefiting from these things. There are other examples, like for example, if you evolve a voltage gated ion channel. Okay, so you evolve a protein that just is a voltage gated ion channel. What you have there is a voltage gated current conductance, aka a transistor, and once you have that transistor, you have a couple of them, you can make a logic gate. And if you can make a logic gate, that logic gate automatically comes with a truth table. It automatically comes with certain other facts, like that the NAND gate is special and all these things. You never had to evolve those. You never had to evolve a truth table. You never had to micromanage any of that. It's a free gift from where? Not from physics. It's from logic and mathematics. So biology is full of these things. The reason that I'm talking about all this stuff now is that we now, having created Anthrobots and Xenobots and various other creatures that have never existed on Earth before, we now have an interesting problem, which is they have all sorts of complex forms of anatomy, forms of behavior, forms of gene expression, forms of physiology. All of these things, they have very specific patterns. And now we have to ask, where did these patterns come from? And normally, when you do this for normal evolved living beings, the answer is, well, a long history of selection. So it was selected to do certain things, not other things. So there you go. That's where it came from. Well, that doesn't work for Xenobots or Anthrobots because there's never been any Anthrobots or Xenobots. There's never been selection to be a good Xenobot and do kinematic replication, or to be a good Anthrobot and to go around healing neural wounds. There's never been any of that. So if you want to understand now, then you have to ask where these things come from. Now, the traditional approach, which is what everybody says when they first see this, and they say, "Oh, it's emergent." And I say, "Well, what does that mean exactly?" And they say, "Well, it's just a fact that holds in our world." So the problem with that, the problem with cashing out this idea of emergence as just meaning surprise, meaning we didn't see it coming. I mean, that's nice, and it's a label, and you can catalog those things and sort of write them down in your big book of emergent facts. But what it doesn't do is help you find the next emergent thing. In other words, I think this idea that it's just a sort of random grab bag of stuff that happens to hold in our world is a very pessimistic approach. It's a very Mysterian approach. I like, and this is a metaphysical claim. This is not something that you can prove with one experiment. But I really think the much more fruitful way is an optimistic approach, which is what the Platonist mathematicians take, which is the hypothesis that this is not a random grab bag of stuff that we are surprised by. It's an ordered space that you can systematically study. In other words, these things are structured in some way that we can move from one to the other. Having found one thing, you can jump from that to something else, and that there is an ordered space of things. Like people, when they make they're making the map of mathematics, that kind of thing. So this is what I think is critical for biology, is that we can now use Xenobots, Anthrobots, and of course all other kinds of biobots, chimeras, all sorts of things without an evolutionary history. We can use them to explore the space.
It's interesting with your artificial organisms like Xenobots that you mentioned, because if they're accessing competencies and forms that they didn't seemingly evolve for, because they're quite coherent, even though you've taken them from an organism. And so then I'm wondering, it's not like a simple pattern, like mathematical or just like computational logic, like you mentioned ion channels earlier. It's something, yeah, much more coherent. Tell me more about those kinds of organisms.
Yeah, the current my current model is simply this, that this Platonic space. And by the way, there's a nomenclature problem here, because when I say Platonic space, what I'm not trying to do is to stick close to the views of Plato. So my point is not that this is exactly what Plato thought. I actually am not sure we know exactly what Plato thought on some of these things, but and there are certainly experts like Matt Siegel and others who actually know much more about this. That I'm far less interested in what the historical facts of what Plato actually thought. What I'm trying to do is come up with a reasonable framework that helps us move forward in new experiments. And what's interesting about the Platonic space as such, the reason I pick up that name rather than just come up with a new name, which at some point we might need to, is that I want to point out to people that this is not a new and crazy thing that I just dragged in here. This is something many mathematicians take very seriously. So so this is similar to the kind of thing they're thinking about. However, the way I extend it is by saying, okay, this space, whatever you call it, has layers that are populated with the low agency static forms that mathematics sees. So this is where the prime numbers and the different facts of about topology and all of this that those things live there. But that's not all of it. There are other I don't want to say regions because I'm not sure how spatialized it actually is, but there are other domains of that space that contain much more complicated, much more active, dynamic forms that we would recognize as behavioral propensities. In other words, it's not just patterns of the distribution of mathematical structures. It's patterns of context sensitive behavior in specific circumstances, which we would recognize as kinds of minds. In other words, that's what I think is going on here. I think that space is not just about the mathematical features we're all used to. We are now realizing that a lot of the ingressions of patterns that we see in biology are these high end things that we would recognize as different kinds of minds, either primitive or quite sophisticated.
Hmm. Tell me why. What part of your work is convincing you that there are minds that are not necessarily localized to the physical, but they must exist in some sense beforehand, before biology uses them, or the mind uses biology? Like, just tell me a bit more about why you'd invoke. Yeah, the, we mentioned it earlier. Like the space is full of minds and agential patterns. It's not just static forms. Tell me more about why that would be.
Yeah, well, there's two pieces to this, and just let's just get the vocabulary down a little bit. So the claim of my current model is that when we build things, and these are anything, including simple machines, biobots, cyborgs, embryos, any of that stuff, what we're actually building are interfaces through which the various forms and the various patterns ingress into and become observable to us in the physical world. Okay, so that's what I think is actually happening here. Now, why do I why do I think these are minds? Well, first of all, we need to decide how do we recognize when we're looking at what we would call a mind of some sort. So some people do it by definition. They say, look, minds are the things that brains do. I think that's a huge mistake. Brains are one particular way to do intelligence, but I think we're much better off having a broader definition of intelligence, because otherwise we leave a lot on the table scientifically. So again, my claim is not that this is not linguistics, it is not philosophy or poetry or any of that. This is science, in the sense that either you make a commitment that you are sticking to a sharp category. Minds are what brains do, and therefore I'm never going to take the tools of cognitive and behavioral science and apply them to anything that aren't brainy animals. Or you say, well, actually, the null hypothesis is that it should be a continuum, because we understand developmental biology, we see what's happening in evolution. It is clearly the null hypothesis should be a continuum view, where these things these capacities slowly change and transform. And anybody who wants to argue for sharp transitions needs to make that argument strongly. In that case, you are facilitated in taking the tools of cognitive and behavioral science and applying them to all sorts of other things. And what I'm arguing is that, as a matter of empirical fact, when you do that, you discover things that otherwise have not been discovered. And I've, my lab and other labs have shown dozens of these things. So my only defense of this is empirical fruitfulness, because by doing this, you enable yourself to discover things that you otherwise never would. And so that's the first thing, right? That this is how we recognize minds. Is we have tools. We already have the tools, from behavioral science, to recognize problem solving, to recognize learning and memory, to recognize navigation of problem spaces. We already have tools for all this, and so we've shown that you can now apply this to all kinds of other things. And then the remaining question is, where do those things come from? And we just talked about that. You can say that it's emergent and just, well, look at that, surprise. Or you can say, okay, there's a particular mapping between the interface that we make, let's say it's an embryo or a robot of a particular type or whatever it's going to be, and the kinds of patterns that are going to come through that interface. And that's the research agenda now, is to understand that mapping. And I think we have to assume that it's rationally understandable. We can't just give up, certainly not at this stage.
Last time we talked about some of the relationships and synergies between different parts of biology, like brains and the kind of cognition they do, but then also embryogenesis and the kind of problem solving that it's doing to get to the right form to create a human or whatever it's creating, and then many other spaces. So I'm just trying to think of what specific example. Like, tell me about a place where you would need to think about a pattern. I guess the thing is that they're all going to be, in some way, the Platonic forms are ingressing in many different areas. But I'm then trying to understand how do we categorize where and in what place are the like are they, clearly our mind is different from the kind of capacities that our cells have or a liver has or embryogenesis has. So then I'm kind of trying to get a differentiation between what kind of patterns we should expect, what kind of minds and competencies we should expect to show up in different places in biology.
Yeah. Well, the fact is that being able to expect specific things is we're nowhere near that. We are very poor at knowing what to expect. We don't even have the beginnings of anything that we could reliably trust that we are expecting the right thing. We are surprised constantly, and that is because we have been for the longest time because of our evolutionary past and our pre-scientific past. We have been constrained in our imagination and in our thinking. We are obsessed with three-dimensional space. It's very hard for us to think about intelligence operating in other spaces. We mainly only recognize things that are of medium size, of medium speed, of that kind of thing, and we love movement in three-dimensional space as embodiment. All of those things are very specific. The actual set of spaces in which biology solves problems is much broader than that. And so knowing what to expect, it's far too early. That is why we need this research program. The research program of diverse intelligence is in my mind, it's exactly that. It's trying to understand what is the space of possible minds, and can we use, and again, yeah, I don't think you can do this from a philosophical armchair. This is empirical research. Can we build interfaces to map out the relationship between the pointers that we create, so the embodiment, the physical embodiments, and the patterns that show up? Uh, this is not just about biology at all. This is not about complexity, really. We've shown that you get some of these things. For example, delayed gratification. Delayed gratification is a simple behavioral capacity that means that this agent can move against its goal gradient in order to recoup gains later on. Okay, so if all you know how to do is try to follow a gradient, you have one kind of competency. But if you're actually sometimes able to actually get further from your goal in order to go around in some fashion and get what you want, that's a more sophisticated capacity. And there's tons of these, and behavioral sciences work these out in great detail. But we found, for example, that even simple bubble sort. Okay, so these are sorting algorithms, just a few lines of code, totally deterministic, completely transparent, no new biology to be discovered. People have been looking at these things for decades, and yet even these very simple things have these kinds of competencies that you would recognize as part of a behavioral repertoire of a sophisticated or perhaps not so sophisticated creature. So we're just bad at knowing when these things are going to show up. This is why we need to do the empirical research.
With, say, finding competencies within algorithms, like you said there, what are your intuitions for why we would find unexpected competencies there? Maybe someone might think, oh, I mean, if they're deterministic, I don't know, you made a mistake, you're looking at it wrong. Um, Tell me about whether we should, because if you find it in evolution or you find it in biological organisms, we feel like we don't understand them anyway. Like we have a lot of work to do. But with a deterministic algorithm, we maybe think we know more about what it should be and what it's supposed to do. So why would we find surprises there?
Yeah, that's my point exactly, and that's exactly why I did it. Because if you do this in biology, then people will say, "Well, no doubt there's a mechanism for this somewhere. We just haven't found it yet." This is why I wanted to take the simplest, most obvious thing. I wanted something that was deterministic. I wanted something where it was transparent. There was no other steps, and I think this is exactly what it's telling us: is that our feeling of, yes, we make these simple things, we know what they can do, and the algorithm tells you what they can do. That's wrong. I think that's completely wrong. And you need examples like this to break us out of that assumption and give us a little humility in that, no, you don't need brains, you don't even need living cells, you don't need enormous complexity to reach the region where our intuitions break down. Our intuitions are already broken around even very simple algorithms. We need a major overhaul of all of this, and that's in particular important for AI and for many other things that are going to be relevant for us. This kind of these kind of surprises, and I think it's very important. I mean, you can say that that's the wrong way of thinking about it, but I go back to, I have only one criterion for any of this, and that's empirical success. If you have a better way of thinking about it that allows you to find new things, that better and more things than were discovered or that were reachable with other frameworks, fantastic. I'm first in line. But let's see it, right? And I think the fact that we do find these things that no one had seen before is telling us that that there's something here, that there's something important here.
Moving to biology, right? It's okay. It's in computer algorithms. And then why, when you create, say, xenobots, anthrobots, these hybrid organisms, are you able to predict some of the forms there? Like, tell me about those experiments creating these organisms, and is there a reason why biology should be expected to do that, to have cells taken, manipulated from one environment, but then still have competencies and capacities to solve problems and live outside of that?
Yeah, I mean, the amazing thing is that they do have these properties, and what often happens is after we do the experiment, people see it and they understand there's no magic as we do, and so they say, well, that makes sense. It had to be this way because they've already seen it. The question is, right? It's actually very different when you're asked, what do you think would happen before? You know, if you and I know this because for some of these things, we tried to get grant funding to do the experiment before we had the answers. And what do people say? They say, well, that's never going to work. That's crazy. That's never going to work. And so that's what you say beforehand, and then after you see it happening, then everybody says, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. So it's really important to have frameworks that don't just explain things, quote unquote, after the fact. They actually lead you to discover the new things. And so, lots of examples. So for example, the xenobots, right? One of the things that you see with xenobots, for example, is this. First of all, kinematic self-replication, the fact that they can make copies of themselves by corralling other cells and compacting them into a similar shape. That one, interestingly enough, actually was predicted, and it was predicted by an AI. So in Josh Bongard's lab, Sane Kriegman and Josh made up this the system that basically simulated the Xenobot behaviors and pointed out that, yeah, this should actually work. They should be able to, so it's not that this thing is impossible to predict. It's just we don't have our intuitions aren't honed correctly, and so nobody saw this coming, really. Then we found out, and this is much more recent data. We did some transcriptomic analysis on these things, and we found out that xenobots express hundreds of transcripts very differently than their parent tissue. We don't change the genome. We don't put in any new synthetic circuits. There are no nanomaterials. All we do is take them away from the normal influence of the other cells that normally forces them to be this like boring two-dimensional outer layer that protects the insides of the embryo. So when you liberate them from these forces, you get to find out what is their intrinsic motivation, so to speak. What will they do normally? And you find out that they express hundreds of new genes, including, as we found out, a gene cluster related to hearing. Okay, it had to do with perception of sound and hearing in other animals. And so we wondered, could this really be, could they really have this capacity? And so Vaibhav Pai and my group did the experiments. We put a little speaker under the dish of xenobots, and we found out that sure enough, they can respond to sound, and they change their behaviors in the presence of sound. And so, and normal embryos don't do this. And so they do have this capacity. Again, we didn't have any ability to know this was going to happen ahead of time. And, no, I'm pretty sure this is all just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what these things can do. And then you get into things like, well, people look at that and they said, when we first rolled out the xenobots, some people said, well, amphibian embryos are pretty plastic, and embryos in general are pretty plastic. And so probably this is just a feature of frog embryology. People call them animal caps, which is a name for the kind of the cells that they come from. And so this is when this was back in 2019 or something. I said, okay, let's get as far away from amphibians and embryos as we can. That would be adult humans. And so Gizem Gamushke and my group, a PhD student, I had asked her to make up to find a protocol, which she did, for taking adult human cells and see what they turn into. And sure enough, they turn into Anthrobots, which have 9,000 genes that are expressed differently than the tissue they come from. Okay, nine. It's about almost half the genome now that are completely different. They have all kinds of crazy capacities, such as healing neural wounds and some other things that we haven't published yet, that are absolutely remarkable. And yeah, again, this is not anything that anybody could have seen coming. So all these things need explanations, and we need an explanation for why those forms, behaviors, and physiological types of decision making are the way they are, and not some other way. That's the job of biology, is to be able to predict these things.
I know it's a question that you're still grappling with, but that is part of what I wanted to talk to you today about, is why the Platonic realm is shaped the way it is. And for example, I talked with the biologist Richard Wagner about the specific shape and contours of genotype space and why it has the mathematical structure that it does, so that organisms can explore it when they have mutations and they don't just die. Genetic mutations actually are quite robust, and you can explore the
Yep.
space and get to new phenotypes. But when I asked about why, at a deep fundamental level, it would be shaped like this, right? It's sort of, it gets too far out, I don't know why, but I know that biology explores it and makes use of it. So tell me, can those kinds of fundamental questions be asked? Like maybe that's what you want to answer, right? Because you don't just want to see, oh, it's emergent. Hey, we got these skin cells and they did this, or we got these embryo cells, they did this. You kind of want to know, like, how is the space structured the way it is? But if there are non-physical patterns, so I guess they're just given to us. Like, does this question make sense?
Well, the question does make sense, and I think, first of all, that before asking anything about why that space is structured, we need to understand how it is structured. So the first step is to get the lay of the land, so to speak, and understand what are the structures in that space. Is it sparse? Is it densely populated? Are there any disconnected parts where you can't get from one region to another? This is what is the metric of that space. There are many questions that we don't know the answers to yet, so we need to do the research to get those answers. After we do that, we can start tackling the question of why it's structured that way in the first place. But I want to point out again, we need to know what a proper explanation looks like. Like what is the shape of an answer to a why question that makes you satisfied? So if you ask, why are frogs who live in a swamp, why are they green? You can come up with an evolutionary answer, because everything that wasn't green got picked off by the birds and whatnot and eaten, and so now what you have left over are the green ones. So that's great, and that those kinds of things can be explained by a specific history of selection. But in mathematics, we have a number of facts that don't have that kind of explanation. So if you're looking at a particular fractal shape, or if you're looking at why certain things happen in 5 dimensions that don't happen in other kinds of dimensions or whatever, the explanation for those things are never anything about the settings of the universal constants at the Big Bang. They're never anything about evolutionary history. Oh, because all the other facts about other spaces got killed off. That doesn't exist. So in mathematics, the question of why is it like that is completely different. And I'm not a philosopher of mathematics, but you have to decide, what does it mean when the answer is, why is the distribution of primes the way it is? The answer sometimes might be, there is no lower level explanation for why. That's just how it is. You can relate it to other things, and you might say, look, isn't this cool? This other mathematical object is basically telling you what the distribution is going to be, and so on, right? So you'll make these lateral connections, but it is not guaranteed, and I'm not sure. I mean, you probably need a mathematician here for this, but I'm not sure it's at all guaranteed that those kinds of why questions in math are not going to terminate with, yeah, that's just how it is. You know, that's just,
Mm-hmm.
why doesn't 13 have any factors? Well, look, that's how it is. And you don't get the kinds of explanations that you get in physics or in biology. So I think we have to think hard about, what do we want the why question to do for us ultimately.
I understand that with mathematics, sometimes you can almost pointlessly keep asking why the world has a structure that it is. But one thing that feels relevant here is you mentioned Darcy Thompson with so he has stuff where you can have these grids of organisms, like that's like one organism,
Right.
then you manipulate it by a certain angle or something,
Yep.
and then it's exactly the shape of the species of another organism.
Yep.
And you've done stuff similarly with planaria and creating new heads of new organisms.
We have.
So that's what I mean by understanding the space of it, because there's like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
coherency, like
Sure.
and yeah,
Sure.
that's really interesting because that seems much more complex than just mathematics.
Uh,
Uh,
well, I don't know. I mean, in some sense, it's more complex, but I don't think it's more complex than mathematics. I think it's a different kind of mathematics. I kind of think that in some sense, it's sort of like microbiology versus all of biology, right? So microbiology focuses on a particular layer. So I think mathematics kind of focuses on a particular layer of the Platonic space, but there are other sciences that we have that can tell us about these other layers. And yeah, the grid deformations in Thompson's book are my favorite. They're my favorite part. I mean, it's an amazing book, but those are also my favorite parts of that book. And that is exactly the kind of thing that we're studying. So yes, we can get the stock planarian hardware to visit attractors that belong to other species of flatworms, but we can also get them to make structures that don't look anything like flatworms. And so one of the things we don't know, for example, is, are the patterns in the Platonic space discrete? Are they really natural kinds? I mean, I'm normally very suspicious of that, but I don't know that that does, that doesn't work in the Platonic space. Are there things in between? And what does it look like? What does the topology of it actually look like? What does time look like, if anything, in that space? There are many deep questions that we don't know, and it's really too early to have any certainty about any of it until we do more experiments to flesh out that mapping between the interfaces that we make in the physical world and the forms that ingress. If we can't even, the bottom line is this: if we can't even guess what's going to come through when you make a bubble sort algorithm, you have zero hope right now of predicting in advance all the forms that are going to come from something as complex as a biological interface. So we just need to roll up our sleeves, do the experiments, and try to map out the space in a functional way.
do you know if when you manipulate planaria to have heads of different species or other strange shapes, whether they like it or not? Um, like I'm just wondering what are the preferences. If you
Yeah,
take a
yeah,
cell from another like an embryo and then you make it some strange hybrid whatever. Like, is
yeah.
it happy being like that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Some people are gonna say that's a bad question. I don't think it's a bad question at all. I think it's good for. I think it's a good scientific question, and I think it's an important ethical question as well. Uh, Look, judging the valence of other minds, especially alien minds. Never mind the actual planarian mind, but how about the morphogenetic mind? The actual decision making cognitive processes that act in morphospace. Trying to understand what the valence is for those things is incredibly difficult for us. We even struggle with things like whales and octopus and things that are much closer to us than some of these alien kinds of minds. But I think we can get there in a couple of ways, and we're working on all this stuff in my group. One way is to simply say, look, how you know when things like something is when they preferentially try to get to it. So behaviorally, right? So say, look, if something keeps, despite various barriers and whatever, if something keeps trying to get to a particular region of state space, you can say that this is that being's version of an attractive an attractive stimulus as opposed to an aversive stimulus. So behaviorally is one way to do it. Another way to do it is, there are stress markers, and this is a really interesting project that we haven't published on yet, but we will. It's going to be kind of quite wild. The good news is that biology seems to reuse some of the same markers to express stress at different levels. So molecules that used to be used for DNA damage and protein misfolding and things like that are, it turns out, reused for expressing stress and unhappiness on and in other at other levels of organization. So we are studying all this, and we can literally ask the question: how stressed out are Xenobot cells about being a Xenobot? And how long does it take them to realize that, well, this is, now I'm a Xenobot. I don't need to worry about not being a frog embryo anymore. All of those kinds of things are actually, I think, reasonable scientific questions. Now, all of this still faces the what they call the hard problem of consciousness, which is, yeah, I'm not saying that you can use these techniques to understand what it's like to be a Xenobot from a first person perspective, because I don't think you can, not in this way anyway. But as far as aversive versus attractive stimuli, as far as stress perception, as far as those kinds of things, I actually think this is a perfectly reasonable research agenda, and we will have those. We'll have the answers to those questions, at least the beginnings of them, later this year.
I also wonder whether Platonic patterns and minds that are non physically instantiated, whether they want to be ingressed into the
Yeah.
physical world, do they have preferences even before their physical instantiation?
I think that's a great question, and here's a guess. Okay, and this is a total guess on my part. I can't prove this in any strong way, but this is what I provisionally think. Uh, I think they do, and I don't know to what degree we can say that this is an active preference. At minimum, I think what we are looking at is that the contents of the Platonic space are under positive pressure. In other words, whenever you make an appropriate interface, that's it. The forms flow through it. It's like imagining a membrane enclosing something, and it's under pressure. So anytime you poke a little hole, and you get automatically stuff starts coming through. At minimum, I think that's the case. My gut feeling is that some of these higher level patterns are not eternal in the way that sometimes people interpret Plato to be saying, that they're just changeless. They just sit there and don't change or don't move. My hypothesis at this point is that the interactions with the physical world are in some way useful to them, meaning that they must change by interaction with the physical world. Otherwise, I just don't see what the point would be, right? And again, it doesn't have to be a point, but optimistically, I think there probably is. And so I suspect that some of these forms are not just frozen and hanging in place. I think there is some kind of buildup or resonance between the interfaces that are built in the physical world and the thing that can come through. How much of that is happening? Does it look like? How much is there a feedback loop where some of these things can actually affect the interfaces that are forming to make it easier for them? You can think of it as a kind of niche construction, where some creatures actually affect the environment in a way that makes it easier for them to inhabit that environment. So maybe there's some of that going on. All of this is pure conjecture. I can't say any of that for sure right now. But I certainly think these are useful hypotheses to be looking at while we're mapping out the space.
On the point of the non physical patterns having agency and in some way wanting to be ingress, helping the physical ingress into more patterns, uh, I've been thinking recently about Christian cosmology. I'm a Christian, but I've been looking at things like angels, and the reason I don't want to, bring up scientifically heretical things to you, but I found it very helpful to understand your work. I'm trying to understand it because there it seems like they think of every non-physical pattern as having some kind of agency. At least some of these theologians do, and so then for them, maybe it wouldn't be that surprising that the physical world is sort of permeated and it's like a pressure coming in. And I don't know if you have anything to, again, partly because I'm trying to search for ideas to kind of help us understand these things, right? If we're now needing to stretch our imaginations to think about the adjacent possibilities of what could be there when we manipulate an organism, or cognition or some systems, we stretch its capacities, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not worried about heresies. There shouldn't be any. There should be no such thing. Science should be the science, so the study of whatever is interesting and useful, and so it is what it is. However, it certainly has not escaped my attention that this view is broadly what the things that I've said about Platonic space is broadly compatible with a number of sort of ancient traditions that talk about stuff like this. But I think it's really critical, and I get a lot of emails where somebody says, "Oh, the great sages have said this, have already said this thousands of years ago." Oh, yes, sure, and I've read all that stuff, and of course they did. But there's a difference between saying there is a beautiful life under every rock, maybe, but to get from there to the point where you can say we now have a rigorous science of knowing what kind of mind it is. How do we recognize it? How do we communicate with it? How do we have an ethical relationship with it? How do we know when we're wrong? Because that's really critical. You can't just assume these things. You have to have some way of knowing that you're on the right track. Doing all of that is really difficult. And it is absolutely not the same thing to just say this stuff versus have something actionable that all of us now, not just the great mystics who could sort of perceive it directly if they could. I'm talking about all of us, the way that your toaster, your toaster works every single time. We know how it works. This should be our ideal for how this stuff needs to work. And what I'm not saying is that this is about the technology of making widgets, or that all of us get to stay the same and not need to change in order to apprehend these great truths. I actually think that we will absolutely need to change. That part is different from your toaster. You don't have to change much in order to use a toaster. You will have to change significantly to really have these kind of relationships with the beings of the future that I think are pretty inevitable at this point. Uh, and yet the job of science here is to go beyond these kind of hypotheticals, and to really provide the tools where everyone can for themselves establish the knowledge they need to see the world in a better way. So
Mm.
if to whatever extent these great traditions have information that helps us do the research, great. But the research, both in inner and traditional third person research, is really what we need to do to make this actionable.
Mm. I wonder though if the non-physical space of patterns, what if they were not static but they changed, or the kind of composition of it, like not just any single pattern, but just, and we don't understand the space, so maybe patterns are connected and we still don't know how to map it out. So maybe it's a question we can answer through research, but could we study whether the space is not static, and so would that then limit how much we could research it?
I suspect it's not static. At least large chunks of it. There may be something that's static. There may be some aspects that are static, but I think the majority of it probably is not static. And my suspicion is that there may well be lateral interactions. So it's not only that the patterns from the space ingress into the physical world, and then the physical interfaces can interact here. I suspect there are lateral interactions in that space as well. Again, this is not something that I'm making any strong claims about now. We don't have any data on it yet. We haven't needed it to explain anything that we're seeing, but that certainly is my suspicion. And if I had to bet right now, I think that's where this is all going to end up. I think that's probably true.
Hmm. Can I ask you a question that moves this discussion more to psychology and the human side
Well, let's
of
try.
things? You, um, you might not have answers to it, but I've seen, and I had a podcast on it, where psychotherapists encounter people. Sometimes they have mental illnesses, gone through great stresses. Normally, it's great stresses, but then they have parts of their psyche that they claim are not parts of them, and it doesn't. It seems like they have psychic entities that are, yeah, not part of them, and obviously, like, we don't fully understand our mind, and even with our own mind, what is us and what is not. Like, there can be unconscious parts of ourselves we don't understand. But do you think that can be understood scientifically?
Well, I mean, my optimistic view is that everything can be understood scientifically if we take a broad enough view of what scientific means, right? So scientific, to me, scientific just means an unflinching, systematic search for the truth. And so my optimistic assumption is that ought to serve us well for almost anything. So that's the background. Now, specifically in terms of things that are not part of ourselves, look, we are not very good at introspecting. And so there are syndromes where people will suddenly look at their leg and say, "That's not my leg," and they get super upset because, like, who attached this cadaver leg to my body? This wasn't mine, and so on. And it's very distressing. So we clearly have many ways to be correct or incorrect about what is part of ourself and what is not. And I'm sure there are many syndromes that failure modes of our cognitive system where one can mistake patterns of our own thinking for some sort of external feature. So I'm sure that's true. Having said all that, the reality is that it is not clear or obvious where our borders actually lie, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to assign some degree of agency to various components of our own mind. And this is William James said this when he said thoughts can be thinkers too. I'm sure I'm butchering the actual quote, but he said something like that. And the idea is this, that while we ourselves, not our bodies, but the patterns that are ingressing, we ourselves are fairly complex psychological patterns. Some of those subunits are not passive data that we move around. Some of them have their own agendas. And so you can imagine the spectrum where you have fleeting thoughts, and those kinds of thoughts are like passive data. We pick them up, we examine them, we do something with them, and off they go, right? But then you got your intrusive and persistent thoughts, and those are kind of hard to get rid of often. And they do, as far as I understand the evidence, they do some niche construction in your brain actually to modify your neural network to make it easier to keep having those obsessive thoughts and things like that. So those have a little bit of a self-preservation agenda, and then you can sort of move further and have actual personality fragments, such as in dissociative identity disorder, that are not themselves full humans, and yet they can do planning and they can do goal-directed activities, and they can sabotage some of the other personalities and whatnot. So I don't think it's crazy at all to say that, look, I have some components in my psychological makeup that are not well modeled by this idea of passive data that just sits there waiting for me to think about it, but better modeled as dynamic entities which themselves have simple goal states that they try to achieve with various degrees of competency or not. So it doesn't seem crazy to me at all. And you know, all there are other things that we normally take as a positive. For example, you're in math class and somebody makes a claim and it sounds crazy. There's no way that's true. And then they show you a proof, and once you've seen the proof, you can't unsee it, and you are now convinced of it. What they've done by showing you that proof is they've now sort of colonized your mind with a belief and some other stuff that goes with it that you cannot get rid of. You just can't unhear it, and you can't unlearn it, and there's nothing you can do to yourself to make you not believe it anymore once you've seen the proof, right? So we are susceptible, and I mean that's kind of the whole point of education. You're supposed to be forced by facts and reason to certain conclusions, whether you like it or not. And that's the goal of every successful example, every successful lecture, book, whatever. You're trying to give the readers some things that they didn't have before that they're not going to be able to get rid of. So yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to just realize that our minds are by design, our minds are susceptible to colonization by other patterns that are not coming from us.
Mm. Your work in general seems kind of strange at first when people encounter it. I know it was for me, but then it kind of makes sense. But I wonder, what are some of the things that you've seen in your career in biology that are still weird to you? What are the strangest things that have happened to you?
Wow, the boy, that's a That's a big question. My career has been very strange, and pretty much everything I see is yeah, on a monthly basis. I see things that blow my mind that are very strange, um, strange and shocking. There have been many examples, and it's kind of funny. About around a lot of these results that we've shown, people ask, did you expect that to happen? And it's always hard to answer, because on the one hand, I did, because we did the experiment. You have to, especially as when you run a lab, you have to commit resources, time, people. You have to commit to them to doing something. So there has to be something inside you that is saying this might work. On the other hand, yeah, really, nothing prepares you for seeing things that you were told. Everything that you've learned, it tells you that this should not be happening. So that's always, I mean, I like it. I enjoy that kind of thing. I love seeing weird things happen, because it's like what are those things, those metal detectors that people walk around on the beach, right, just waiting for that ping that tells you that there's something here that shouldn't be here, that might actually be valuable. I love it, and part of that probably is that my biology background isn't the same as many other people in the field. I was a computer scientist first. I picked up a lot of biology before my PhD in genetics, but I didn't have the same prep as a lot of other people did, and going through and having some of the same priors sort of drilled into you that this is how it needs to work. But yeah, there have been a lot of really strange things.
Like that's in terms of experiments. So has it changed your beliefs or just beliefs about the world more generally in your life, or like other things you've seen outside of experiments? Like, I can't explain this, but then now I'm more open to maybe this could be explained at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think everything can be explained at some point in the future, if we work at it. I think explain is funny. I don't exactly know what explain means, but understood as is I think a better term, in terms of being able to internalize something to the point where it becomes not just data and knowledge, but it becomes wisdom in some way, that you actually incorporate it to the other things that to give you a better, a more meaningful life. I think everything can be understood in that sense eventually. But yeah,
Mm.
I just think the whole field of diverse intelligence, the emerging field of diverse intelligence, is really telling us that we are so bad at recognizing. I've called it mind blindness. We are so bad at recognizing unconventional intelligences all around us in different implementations and so on, that I think the world is actually very different from the classic picture, and also how it seems intuitively to us. And so that
Mm.
that has been a major shift. And every time, one way I sometimes give this, I have a new talk that I just started giving, that basically shows this, like, scale of different kinds of numbers that people have discovered. You start with the counting numbers, and then somebody came up with zero, and then we got these negative numbers, and then we had some rational in irrationals, and whatever, and you sort of go all the way up to all these progressively more weird kind of numbers. And the thing is that every time people sort of discovered new kinds of numbers, it was really disruptive. People died over this whole irrational thing. People were killed over it, and it just rips up some old assumptions, and it's very uncomfortable, and it makes. But the people who get the credit are the ones who stick with it and follow the science, and they adjust their past categories to adjust with novel discoveries. So I think this the exact same thing is happening with diverse intelligence. So we thought it was just brains, and then we found out that, yeah, actually those same mechanisms are all over the body, and then we can see some of that in things that are not biologicals at all, and then we can see some of those things in patterns that are not physical embodiments at all. And then there's some weirder steps after that I don't have time to get into here, but you'll see, later this year, there's going to be a couple of really crazy papers from our group looking at those kinds of behavioral competencies in very unconventional places. So that's something that I think now permeates my thinking as I look around the world. I think, my God, it's like in the olden days, before we had a good theory of electromagnetism, and we just had no idea that lightning, static electricity, magnets, and light were actually, not only were they all one thing, where we all thought they were just different things, but also all we can see is like a tiny sliver of that spectrum, and then there's this massive amount of EM spectrum out there that we couldn't use until we had a good theory, until we had tools. So this is how I feel now, is that we're just like looking through everything through a tiny slit in terms of being able to recognize other kinds of intelligence.
Thank you, Mike. This has been really fun. Do you point people to anywhere usually after these? I know you have your academic YouTube channel. Anywhere else?
I have a blog where I write about what I think all of this stuff means in terms of the scientific discoveries that we make, and that's called thoughtforms.life. Thoughtforms.life is the blog. There's also a podcast which organizes all the material from our center YouTube channel, and yeah, I guess that's it. Those are the things.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very
Awesome.
much. Yeah, thank you for the discussion, and I hope you feel better.
Thank you. This was fun, so it's uplifted my mood.
Good, good.